Good morning. My name is Andrew, and I'm going to take you all through um, a presentation on the introduction to logistics. Logistics is very broad, it's a very complicated subject. So what I thought I would do is begin at the very first principles, and then as we develop and as we include more and more things into the learning universe, um, we'll be able to go into all the different ways of shipping and all the different areas in more detail, and we can have different people come in and speak on this. But I just wanted to start from sort of a beginner's perspective, just at a very first principles, first look approach. And then from there, hopefully, as we build our tools, we'll be able to have more and more information and more resource available for logistics. But this is just an introduction. So welcome. I really appreciate you and taking time to sit and listen to me and go through this presentation. So I love this quote. It says, "Logistics is simple, but not easy." It's by Joe Lynch. And the reason I love this quote is it's really emphasizes the heart of logistics, right? Where the principles and the ideas are simple, but the implementation can be quite difficult and complex. And I think that's where a lot of us get stuck in, it sounds very simple. Get something, put it on a plane or a ship or a truck and get it from point A to point B. But there's so many other elements that come into making that simple ask possible. So when we talk about logistics, we're really talking about the process of planning, implementing, and controlling the flow and storage of goods and information from where the goods begin to where they need to go to the end user. So I think the elements that we often forget about logistics is really the planning element and also the information flow. Those are the two critical elements of logistics that are often missed by many people starting out, and often that's probably the most critical. So what are we going to talk about today? Today we're going to talk about pre-shipping. As we look back, we talk about the elements of planning. So pre-shipping is what it takes to make sure that your shipment is ready to go. The packing process, we'll go through something very important called Incoterms. And I'm sure you've heard some of these things. Maybe you've heard of XWorks, maybe you've heard of FOB, maybe you've heard of DDU. We'll go through some of those in detail and just sort of introduce the concepts and why they're important to begin with. Then lastly, we'll just look at the modes of transport and see what options are available to us when we're thinking about logistics. So let's talk about pre-shipping. So pre-shipping really, this is the point at which you really focus on gathering as much information as possible to make your shipment a success. So the information, as this quote says, information about the package is as important as the delivery of the package itself. This is a CEO of FedEx talking, and that's because you need to know how much does a package weigh? What's the size of the package? What's in the package? What are the rules for shipping out of your country? What are the rules for the country that you're shipping to? All of these things come together. All this information you need to know ahead of time before you ship. And I always encourage people to start thinking about shipping in their production process 2 weeks out from your planned ship date. That's a really great time to start now putting things together and start asking those a lot of those difficult questions. For some places, actually, you need to think about it even further, even earlier. But I think 2 weeks is a good basis to start thinking, okay, do I know roughly how much the goods will weigh? Do I know roughly what the dimensions are? Do I know where I'm shipping to? Do I know the terms in which I'm shipping these goods to? So all of that is, we'll cover that. And but yeah, so there's a pre-shipping process. So the first question I always encourage people to ask themselves even before you start, before you secure your POs, is first of all, are you ready to export? First of all, do you have all your documentation? So are you a registered business? Each country has different rules as to who can export and who can't, and how they can receive payment. So making sure that you're properly registered to do the work that you intend to do is very, very important. And this is something that can cause a lot of delays if a license is expired or a license hasn't been applied for. If you're doing certain products, such as wood products in some countries, that's highly regulated. In other countries, you have to have a special license to export ceramics because of the environment that they're in, and they expect a level of certification to allow you to be able to export. So those are the questions you need to ask and start working on ahead of time. Most buyers, PBP included, won't want to consider this. They will expect you to have this sorted out well before you ship. That would be the expectation when you're doing international business. Number two is to check what taxes and exemptions are available to you. So what the taxes are, typically they're duties, sometimes they're export duties, meaning to ship out of a country. Sometimes there'll be some fees and some fees that you might have to pay for. So it's important that you sort of calculate those into your planning and sort of thinking, okay, maybe it takes maybe it can be something as simple as a $5 fee, but it takes 2-3 days to process the paperwork for that license or for whatever you're working at. So you also have to look at the amount, but also how long it takes to process the licenses, the fees, and everything, so that you can meet your shipping timelines. Importantly, it's just one of those things to make sure that when you're doing this, you also add buffer. We also know how with a lot of agencies, you have, they'll have on their SLAs with a government agency, they'll say, hey, it takes 24 hours to do this. But then lo and behold, in practice, it takes 2 days, or it takes a week. So understanding that, it's important to understand that ahead of time. And this is why I keep saying the pre-shipment process starts well ahead of the time you need to, before you plan to ship, is because then you can start working on these things before the shipment is actually ready to go out. Then the other things you need to consider, is there any restrictions that you should be aware of for your product? And so often restrictions come with licenses and quotas in some instances, but more often it's licenses. For a common what I would call a restriction would be for wood products, is you to import wood products into the United States, to export wood products into the United States. There's something called a Lacey Act that you typically need to submit. There are a lot of exemptions, but typically you'll find that as soon as you encounter customs, they will ask for a Lacey Act if they know there's wood for wood products. So it's very important to understand in your products what the process is for bringing those products into the country that you are aiming to export to. The other extra credit thing I keep that you can, it's an option, and it's something that you do well before you're exporting, well before you have a purchase order, is check with your trade promotion agency, right? So you have ITPO, that's India Trade Promotion Agency. ProMexico is another one. CAPROBA, which is active in Kenya. And each country has a TPO, a trade promotion agency. And often those agencies' work is to support and facilitate exports out of their countries. So they often provide a lot of resources, including training, including export support. If you have an issue of customs that needs clarification or needs an intervention, they sort of act on behalf of the private sector in relation with government. So they work very closely with their chambers of commerce and other similar kinds of organizations. But the idea here is you normally have a government agency, and it can change to the extent of the support that they can provide, but they normally exist to support you. And so it's always important to just take a moment to see if there's any support or if there's any value that you can extract from them. Because sometimes they might be aware of some trade deals or some incentives that can make exporting more accessible or cheaper for you. Now, once you have sort of like the big picture questions answered, the question becomes, is your package ready to export? So the key thing is, first of all, identifying the service providers that you need. Do you have a customs broker who will help you do any customs brokerage in your country to enable you to export? The other question is, where can I get packing materials? This is very, very vital to making sure your goods arrive in good shape. A lot of buyers might have specific instructions as to how they might expect the goods to be exported. So it's very, very important that you consider this as part of your pre-export processes. Like, do I know who, if I need to get goods palletized, who provides palletization services in my area? Who provides all the ancillary services like trucking, like moving my goods from my production facility all the way to the airport? Who does fumigation? Who can prepare where if I need a certificate of origin? Who will help me with that? Typically, your customs broker will help you, but having identified that and understanding the process is very, very important, especially as your shipments and the order sizes grow larger. Some of these services are critical for a small package that you're sending through DHL. Maybe it's 1 or 2 kilos. Maybe it's not something that you need to do. But as you grow, if you have a 50 kilo, 100 kilo package that you won't be able to put on DHL, you need to air freight. All of these services all of a sudden become very, very important. And you don't want to be at a point where you're looking for those services as you're working on the shipment. You want to have all those things ready so that you just can just quickly pick up your call or drop an email and and write to maybe 2 or 3 service providers and say, hey, what's your timeline, or can I get boxes by tomorrow so that I can pack my goods? All of those things you need to sort of want, and you'd like to ideally have those in situ before even shipping. All right, so let's now move to Incoterms, right? And so Incoterms are internationally recognized rules that define the responsibilities of the seller and the buyer. So the beauty of Incoterms and the reason people like using them is they assign responsibility and they assign roles. So it becomes a very, very easy way of quickly identifying who does what in the process of a shipment. Okay, so as the definition here points out, they are about they're really about simplifying and standardizing how we talk about trade and how we talk about shipping and logistics. So they do, ideally, they do provide a framework for understanding who's responsible for what and who pays for it, because sometimes you can be responsible for something, but you won't pay for it, or you can be responsible for something and you have to pay for it, and who assumes the risks at different points along the shipment, right? And so we'll go through that as we go. And so as we speak, there are about 11 Incoterms, and the Incoterms are decided and agreed upon by the International Chamber of Commerce. However, the thing to keep in mind with Incoterms is you really want to narrow down and focus on the ones that matter most to you. If you see, you'll find that different industries use different Incoterms. So you might find one Incoterm just is never viable for necessary for the kind of work that you do. So you don't focus a lot of time on knowing that one. But the ones that are relevant for you, and we'll go through to some of the most relevant ones, particularly in the handmade and craft sector, you really need to understand it clearly and work on this building competency around what to expect when somebody tells you, oh, I want your FOB cost, or I want your XWorks cost, or I want your DDU or DDP cost. So we'll go through that, but it's just important to know that there are 11 of them. And the whole goal is just to assign responsibility, understand where the risk lies and who's responsible for that risk and who pays for things. So within the global logistics process, and this is where Incoterms come to play, they look at they aim to clarify who's responsible for packing and who's responsible for loading at the port of entry, who's responsible for the preliminary transport. That means moving goods from the factory, from the point of production to the port of exit, who's responsible for customs handling, so on and so forth. So all of these things, the idea around Incoterms is really to assign responsibility either with the buyer and the seller at each point. So Incoterms really aim to identify, the responsibilities all along the logistics chain. So typically when shipping with PBP, because PBP will be for most shipments the importer of record and the buyer of record for all of them, PBP will be the one through our maker terms setting the Incoterm and the point and the terms at which we will be doing logistics and serving our customers. So this will be very important to understand what your responsibilities are at each point. So now let's just look at them in detail. What are these Incoterms? All right, so the first Incoterm I want us to go into detail is at XWorks, right? So XWorks is factory gate. It means your responsibility as the seller is to pack the goods ready for export. And you see export packing. So you don't just pack it as if it's, going to your neighbors. Your responsibility is to pack it in a way that is sufficient to successfully transport the goods from point A to point B. That includes, that may include palletization, right? If your good cannot be transported well without palletizing, it's your responsibility from an XWorks perspective to have those goods ready to be packed and ready to be collected. Going there onwards, once you get it to your factory gate, so basically it means you put it somewhere, you've got your goods, they're packed and ready to go, and you've put them somewhere where they can easily be collected. The responsibility now for those products all the way to delivering the goods becomes the buyer's responsibility. So the buyer has a responsibility to now take on board all those issues. And you can see the issue of insurance in this case is negotiable. So we can agree and say, hey, if you are so confident in your packing, let's give you the responsibility for insuring the goods, or as a buyer, or as a seller, you can come in and say, hey, since you're the one figuring out how you're shipping everything, it's your responsibility to figure out the insurance. So in this instance, the insurance on XWorks basis is typically something that the buyer and the seller agree upon together. But you can see all the risk is transferred as soon as the goods are collected, right? This all becomes an issue for the buyer to take care of if they collect the goods from the factory gate. What I forgot to mention is also that most of the Incoterms fit in different groups that cover whether the mode of transport as well. So the Incoterm will also dictate typically the mode of transport. There are a few instances where sort of common parlance or just how people talk means that some Incoterms end up being used a bit more broadly, but generally, strictly speaking, things like XWorks and free carrier to place all sit with refer to any mode of transport. Others refer to typically refer to different modes of transports, or they can be specific as to any mode, or is specifically for sea freight. So if you look broadly, you can sort of understand each category has, there's some broad categories. So any Incoterm that begins with C sets up the seller as a contract for the carriage without assuming any risk during the shipment. So if you see C, the seller sorts out the shipping while the risk really is still on the buyer. If you see anything beginning with D, it sets all, generally D tends to set all the costs and risks needed for shipping and bringing the goods to the place of destination. And you'll notice that all of them tend to be delivered. So it's delivered at place, unloaded, delivered, duty paid, right? So so all of those really are just, if you think about all the ones that are coming with D, the D Incoterms really just mean, hey, it's your responsibility as a seller to get all the goods all the way to the end user. The E Incoterms are really about making goods available at the seller's premises, right? And there's only one, it's XWorks, which I went through. And then the Group F Incoterms really cover the delivery of goods to a certain point appointed by the buyer. So when you see F, you're really saying, hey, that's really the buyer saying, I want you to deliver these goods at this specific point. And the ones that we see as free along ship and free on board, right? Those are the common ones, and the free carrier place. So let me go down to the next one. So we really, these are the handy ones to have when you're thinking about our sector. So XWorks is your factory gate, right? So you always have to consider the pricing when somebody asks you to quote for something. You need to clarify. So for example, XWorks means, what does it cost to, if I come and pick it up straight from your factory? Everything else becomes my headache to deal with. So XWorks pricing just means you don't factor in anything other than just your production costs, your margins, everything that you have to do to make your goods, pack the goods ready for export. That's the pricing that you sort of consider when you're doing XWorks pricing. FOB is very important because FOB, remember as I mentioned, FOB, the F category of goods, is typically indicates where the goods, the buyer will sort of dictate where the goods should be delivered, and that's at that point is when the transfer of risk comes in. So FOB stands for free on board, and free on board, typically the expectation on most free on board agreements and shipments is that you as the seller will pack and deliver the goods and make sure that the goods are ready for export. That means if there's anything that requires export processing, if it's a license, if they need to be fumigated, if they need to be, if they need to have a certain export clearance, all that is your responsibility to undertake, right? And then after that, the buyer will take custody of goods and then move them across the board. So FOB typically can mean that the person can tell you, hey, please deliver these goods to this warehouse and this warehouse from there. Once the goods are received and the paperwork is received, they will now take on the aspects of shipping and delivering the goods across to where they need to go to. So the key thing to remember with FOB is also remember your pricing. Remember to cost in at the price of goods, right? Because this is at the price of goods, to think about how much is my local transport do I need? How much of local transport do I need to cost in? How much of my the administrative elements do I also need to cost in to make sure that I can effectively have FOB pricing? Because what I've seen happen plenty of times is, and this is not just with PBP, this is across the industry. Somebody will give an XRX price as their FOB price. And then when the goods are ready to ship, the buyer will say, hey, okay, please take them and have the goods delivered ready to go at this warehouse near the port. And then the goods will arrive. And then the seller will say, oh my goodness, but who's going to pay for the transport to the port, and who's going to pay for the customs and brokerage and everything? And all of a sudden, the seller will say, well, we agreed when we signed our contract and we started the purchase agreement that everything is on FOB. So I'm only taking care of the shipping. I don't care if that cost is on you. And you see that people have often lost some money because of this level of sort of missing the pricing element on that. So it's very, very important for you to understand that FOB means that you factor in as much as you can for basically running and delivering your goods locally. Lastly, the other one that's very important to think about is delivered at place pricing. Now, this is a bit more tricky to actually have it into the cost of goods as much as you can. But that just means that the buyer wants their goods at their place, right? So you will have to know how to price out your cost of logistics so that you can now have the ability to quote for that. So you will have to know how much it costs to ship, and that can be done by doing a spot check with either your freight forwarder, or if you're doing a small shipment and you're doing with courier, you can always check with DHL or UPS or RMX or whoever you use, whoever your preferred shipping partner for small shipments is. But that normally what you can do with DAP pricing a lot of times is you add that layer and you sort of add it separately. You can add a line item and say, this is our cost for shipping. But the thing you have to understand with DAP pricing is often the expectation is that you will handle all the logistics costs with the exception of customs clearance, right? So you'll tell them, hey, the goods are here. Here's an invoice for customs. Please pay it immediately so that I can, organize the delivery all the way back to wherever you want it delivered to your. But I think the key thing with all of these is just to know that these are the commonly used commonly used Incoterms, and how people's expectation with each one, right? So with XWorks, I just want to reemphasize, that's your factory gate price, right? So you don't factory gate, including packaging. FOB is factory gate pricing, as well as transportation and all the paperwork and administrative costs, making sure that the goods are ready for export. Those are on you. So make sure you figure out how to quote those and add those into your pricing. Then DAP pricing, delivered at place. That again is really for us to enable us to ensure that the goods are delivered to the buyer's place easily. And their expectation there is they don't want, basically, when you have somebody ask you that, basically the buyer doesn't want the headache of figuring out all the logistics and all these other things. So they just want to ensure that their goods are delivered in a timely manner. The key thing with DAP is also to remember, if you are the one coordinating the shipment, to communicate very, very clearly in terms of timelines and where the shipment is at, and so that people sort of also can plan to receive. That's number one. And then also plan for the key points where their intervention might be needed, for example, at customs. So it's very important that you communicate clearly. You say, hey, the goods are on the way. So just know that in the next day or two, I'll be reaching out, or somebody will be reaching out with a customs invoice. So please be be expecting this. But the key thing, especially when you're doing things from FOB onwards to DAP, is also being mindful to be hyper communicative. All right, so let's just go next to the common modes of shipping. And there's another quote I love about logistics. It says, leaders win through logistics. Vision, sure. Strategy, yes. But when you go to war, you need to have both toilet paper and bullets at the right place at the right time. So the reason I'm bringing this quote in is as we look at the different ways of shipping, it really is about finding the right fit for the needs of your buyer. And that can be from a cost perspective, from a timing perspective. And normally those 2 points sit on opposite ends, right? So if you think about a straight line, on one end at 1 is time, and then on the other end is price, right? And normally those 2 things are pulling at each other. So the cheaper options tend to take longer, and the more expensive options generally are quick and bring in a lot of efficiency from a time perspective, but not from a price perspective. So let's talk about courier shipping to begin with. So courier refers to transportation of packages, documents, and goods from one location to another using a courier. Couriers are specialized logistics providers, and their areas of emphasis is speed and efficiency door-to-door services. And this is why couriers are very popular, is because they take care of everything. You just go drop off the goods at the UPS store, and you fill in a bunch of paperwork, you pay, and off they go. They don't get you involved in the weeds of the shipment as much as they can. But the idea for them really is the emphasis is on quick shipments, and you can see what they've specialized in is documents and packages. So they tend to want to focus on smaller packages that they can of lower value, so that they can just ship it across very quickly and move them and deliver quickly. So the benefits are typically that couriers provide a door-to-door service. So they can even pick up packages from where you're sending from, and they will take it all the way to the doorstep. And typically they will not get it, they will do this in a very seamless manner. The other benefit you find from courier firms is they tend to have a very secure process just because of the way they move and the fact that nothing ever sits, everything's always in motion. They offer a lot of really good, you're pretty confident that your package is secure. And then they also offer additional services that make sure that the goods are being delivered to the right place, such as signature confirmation, and they can allow you to have special handling instructions. You can tell them, hey, please deliver between this time and this time typically. And so those are sort of like the real disadvantages. And some courier services allow you to specialize and give special instructions. And yeah, and then lastly, I think the other benefit is ease of tracking. You'll find that with other shipping modes, the tracking can be quite limited in terms of what your options are. However, the disadvantages are typically shipping with courier is very expensive. They will have limits on the size and the weight of the items that you can ship. They tend to have a lot of surcharges and hidden costs. For example, if you might quote, for example, shipping to New York City will be one price, but if it's going to a rural area of New York State, they'll add a surcharge, which at the point of quoting might not be there, but then when you're going to pay for the shipment, you'll find that that this rural delivery surcharge, or they'll say, hey, because this wasn't packed in our branded packaging, we'll surcharge you a certain amount to use your own packaging. So they can have different surcharges that you have to really be mindful of. And the more you use them, I guess, the more aware you become of them, but that's a serious disadvantage. The last one is the environmental impact of courier shipping. because of the speed, everything is being sent by air. It's being sent, when it comes to delivery, it's being delivered in small, inefficient cars, vans. So you typically find that courier shipment has some of the highest environmental impact in the logistics chain, right? And that's something that a lot of the courier firms will have options for you to try to offset your carbon. But the reality of it is, from an environmental perspective, it's not a very efficient way to ship. And generally, what I would say is, unless your shipment is too small, you should probably avoid shipping courier unless, unless it's needed urgently, or the other options just aren't available to you for various reasons. Because as you said, the next mode of shipping that I want us to cover is air freight. So air freight typically works best for shipments with 100 kilos or more. And basically what a lot of air freight does is it leverages commercial airlines. If you've ever flown anywhere, you'll notice that the windows and where you're sitting is pretty high. So after they put in your luggage for your vacation or wherever you're going, and they stuff it, there's normally quite a lot of space left over on a plane that they can use to freight goods. And so that opens them up for the air freight services. And then you do have dedicated planes and dedicated lines that just ship cargo by themselves. But air freight is typically leverages commercial airlines to move goods around the world. So air freight forwarders and logistics company who will do the bookings for you, who will support you while putting the documentation together, who will help with the customs clearance process. And lastly, using a freight forwarder will help you sort of do the last mile delivery. Because if you go directly to, for example, KLM, KLM will say, hey, we can move the goods from this airport to that airport, no problem. But we have no idea about the last mile delivery, moving it out of the airport over to wherever the goods are supposed to be delivered. We have no idea about the customs process. All we're going to be doing here is moving the goods from point A to point B. So you will need a freight forwarder and a customs agent at each point to help you figure that out. So having a reliable freight forwarder who can help you sort of identify, and they will have a network of people that they use to help you do the clearing of the goods and move the goods smoothly, and maybe even pick up the goods from your warehouse all the way out to the final last mile delivery. So when you're considering air freight, always work with a freight forwarder, and a reputable freight forwarder for that matter. So what are the benefits of air freight? First of all, it's speed. Courier is very quick. Courier shipments normally take a few days, depending on where in the world they're coming from. Air freight takes about a week, and then plus another day or two for clearing. So normally that's about 6 to 7 days. So courier shipment might take about 5 days. Air freight will take about 7 days. And normally those couple days difference really brings down the costs. The other benefit is reliability. They're planes flying out every day. So the other advantage of air freight is if you miss one flight, typically if your goods miss one flight, if you're supposed to ship out on Monday, typically you can also ship out the following day on Tuesday, because the regular cadence of flights is such that of global air travel is you rarely have to wait very long to find the next opportunity to ship. So it helps them become very reliable and very predictable. And the delays, if any, when it comes to air freight shipments, are measured in a matter of days at most, never in, and sometimes even as little as hours, depending if on the destination of goods. The other thing about air freight that makes it really, really beneficial is it has a global reach. It can get anywhere. Most places have airports, and so you can actually get goods into countries very easy. And there's pretty high security because you're moving goods. Once goods are in airports, they don't really, they're moving from high security areas onto a plane, which is a high security area, off again, once they land into a high security area. So because of the short transit times and because of the nature of where those goods are operating, if goods are well packed, you're pretty confident that the goods will arrive in good shape and they're pretty secure from theft or damage. But that's not to say it never happens, but it is just to say that they tend to be a bit more secure. And then, of course, because of the nature of air freight, you do get a lot of flexibility. So what are the disadvantages of shipping? Is it's still pretty expensive compared to sea freight, which we're coming to next. And then there are many restrictions to different cargo types. For a sector, that doesn't matter as much, but it's worth noting. If you have a product that uses lithium-ion batteries, that product will require a special packaging, or in some instances, depending on the type of lithium-ion type battery, it can't be air freighted at all. Customs complexities, this is something compared to courier shipments, it becomes something that I mentioned. It's very important to understand and work closely with your freight forwarder. And normally what I noticed is most freight forwarding companies also double up as customs brokerage. So they offer customs brokerage services. So it's very important to sort of have those pieces put together to so that they can work. The other issue, which we bump into a lot, is limited tracking beyond airports. The beauty, if you use, for example, KLM, the KLM will issue you a airway bill number. And so you can see the goods once they leave the airport, once they leave the port of origin. You can see how they're flying from point A to point B, if they're, switching, moving, connecting. But once the goods are cleared, you typically don't have the ability to track the goods once the goods have been cleared. And those something that you need to discuss very clearly with your freight forwarder to make sure that you have visibility once the goods have been cleared on that last mile delivery. As I mentioned, complex routing. So sometimes things will go around the world, in a way. They will make many stops on the way to the delivery. I've seen a shipment have as many as 10 stops moving goods. I think I was moving goods from the US to Kenya, and they just moved. It was just the unfortunate way of the way the airline decided to book the shipments. It moved from one city in the US to another, then it booked a flight to Europe, and then it moved from one city in Europe to another city in Europe, then it moved to the Middle East, and then it moved back to Europe, and so it took so many steps just to get that product in. So sometimes they can route it very complexly, and especially in places as vast as the United States, where the points of entry might be fewer than the total places you can deliver. So if you have something to deliver, I don't know, to, let's say, Wyoming, you might find that you will have to really do a lot of configuring. Do I fly it into Denver? Do I fly it into Chicago? Or, so that you can find the best fit to get those goods to the last mile. Sometimes that can be quite complex. And the other thing that is very important for me to mention is the delays that occur as a result of congestion and high demand. So what you'll find is that during peak periods of travel, the available space for air freight reduces, right? So if you try to air freight things during Christmas when everybody is traveling, or during the summer, you'll find that that you might have a few delays. You might find that your packages, for example, if you have, let's say, 10 boxes, instead of all 10 shipping, you'll find maybe they're shipping 2 today, then the rest tomorrow, or some other configuration. just because the congestion happens to be quite a bit during peak travel times or times of high demand. So that's something to be mindful of, especially if you're facing a tight timeline, is that you can have these delays that, they're a day or two, they're number very, very long. I think the longest delay I've ever seen on an air freight is about a week to get the goods lifted up. But those congestion issues do happen, and especially other times that can create congestion can be times when you have like a natural disaster. For example, I don't know if any of you remember many years ago, there was that issue of the volcano in was it in Greenland or Iceland that was spewing dust across Europe, and all of a sudden the amount of planes that were flying was dramatically reduced, and so that created a huge backlog and in goods that could move around the world, and so those delays happen, and so you can be subject to some global factors that sort of limit how quickly you can get your goods across to your customer. Lastly, we're going to talk about sea freight. Sea freight is also known as ocean freight or maritime shipping. Really is putting things on large container ships. And this is probably the least used mode of shipping for a lot of people. And the advantages of sea freight is it's cost effective. There are very few restrictions. You can send very many goods, and it has the ability to really, really improve your costs, for your shipping costs. The key thing to remember here is also that it does take some time, typically shipping via sea. But this sort of, I look at sea freight and I sort of cluster it along with trucking for those people, for example, who are in Mexico and they use trucking. A lot of the factors are very, very similar in terms of it does take a bit longer than to truck something. Maybe some goods take up to 2 weeks to a month to truck up from Mexico across the border into the US, into the final point of destination. But sea freight and trucks really, really are the main gears of shipping, of global shipping. And the thing I would want to emphasize with all of you is you don't have to fill a whole container to have access to sea freight or trucks. There is something called less than container load shipping, LCL, or less than truckload shipping if it's going via land trucks, which allows you to ship as little as 1 cubic meter or less and put those goods on a truck, and it's called consolidation. And what that means is those goods are put together with other goods going to. Don't think that you have to wait until you can get an order that fills a container to have access to the benefits of sea freight. So what are the advantages of sea freight? First of all, it's cost effective. Normally, sea freight can be half or even lower depending on the quantities you're shipping, the cost of other modes of shipping. It can, as I mentioned, it can handle a wide range of cargo. The reason I bring that up is especially for bulkier items, it is far, far more efficient to ship them via sea because the charge because typically sea freight charges by volume. So you know your cost per volume, whereas if you're paying for volume using air freight, the costs tend to be really ridiculous and they really surcharge you quite a bit for shipping voluminous things. Whereas sea freight, they're agnostic to that. They actually don't mind shipping bulky things. So if you have a bulky order, one option and one thing you can consider is using sea freight or LTL. The sea freight also has a lower environmental impact compared to other shipping. I think because you're shipping so much at such large volumes overall, the individual impact of shipping goods using sea freight is much, much cheaper. So what are the disadvantages? It takes a long time to ship via sea freight. From some ports of origin, it can take up to 6 months. That's not typical, but there are some places, especially if you're shipping less than container load, it can take a very, very long time to ship that way. There's limited accessibility because if you're really, really far inland from where you're operating or where you're delivering to is very, very far inland. You have to figure out how to move the goods now from the port into the final place you're either from where you're from the port into where you're shipping. So I think it's just a very important thing to consider when you're considering sea freight, because it might be cheap to get it all the way to the port you're shipping to, but then you might find that the cost of shipping it now, trucking it from the port all the way inland to the final destination will really, really affect your pricing. So that's something really to consider when you're looking at sea freight. Also, same holds true for LTL shipments. That you'll probably get a quote with an LTL shipment from Mexico to the United States. They'll probably quote for you in a way that says, hey, from wherever we are to Nuevo Laredo will cost this much, then moving it across the border will cost this much, and then the final cost from Laredo all the way to wherever we're sending the goods to will cost a different price. So those are the things that that will affect, right? So it's always good to consider all those things when you're looking at accessibility and your transportation. The other thing to also consider is there's a lot more complexity with the paperwork. And I go back to having a really, really solid freight forwarder who can walk with you, handhold you as the process moves along. I think it's very, very key because getting paperwork wrong can be very, very expensive and it can be very, very tricky. If the goods arrive at your port of at the port of entry and they start asking for this, that, the other, and you don't have that ahead of time, it can be very, very stressful. Storage charges can wrap up very, very quickly, and from a sea freight perspective, can be very, very expensive. Some ports charge as much as several $100s per day for goods that remain uncleared. So it's very, very important to understand the complexity of the paperwork and making sure that those issues are addressed. The other disadvantage is sometimes the delays can happen on a span of weeks, not days, right? So if a ship has a problem at sea and has to go to port and they have to wait for another ship to be available, such things, typically like with air freight, if a plane is not available within 48 hours maximum, and that's a very long time, they have found a plane to come pick up the goods and pick up the passengers and move them to wherever they need to go. On sea freight, delays that do happen from time to time can take weeks, and if there are any issues, if it has to move into a port and pick up more containers and those containers aren't ready to go and they need a few more days, it can take time. And especially with consolidation, the problem is because you're relying on other people also having their paperwork in order, you might have delivered something on time to make a shipment, but if somebody else has an issue and their paperwork isn't in order, you can have delays as a result of that. So it's something to be mindful of when you're booking sea freight. Then the other thing is, from a tracking perspective, since sea freight takes so long, it can take a month or two to get your goods from point A to point B. You have to be very, very mindful and very open to communicating with your buyers as to what's going on with the shipment, right? And you need to set that expectation early. So you will be saying, hey, because this is going to take about a month, I'll be letting you know what's going on with the shipping every week, or I'll be sending an update every week or every couple of weeks. just so that somebody can know what's happening. I think it's very, very important. Yeah, so I think it's just very, very important when you're looking at that, just think about also how that will impact how you'll be communicating with your buyer in the event that you opt for sea freight or trucking goods across. The other thing you have to be mindful of is costs that you don't expect, particularly if you expected to send the goods loose, but then they require palletization. Normally pallets are about $60 per pallet for as a pretty standard palletization fee. Sometimes for less than container load shipping, they charge you a fee for stuffing. That means adding your goods onto the goods. So it's just here, the key thing here is just to be mindful of and discussing very, very clearly with your freight forwarder what the fees are to expect so that you don't have any nasty surprises as you move along. All right. So sorry, this is very long. I thought it would only take 30 minutes, but this is just a very quick introduction to logistics. As you can see, we've really just done it at surface level, and doing surface level discussion has been an hour worth of me talking. But please let me know if you have any questions. You can always send any questions you have to my email over here, andrew@poweredbypeople.com. But I'm very thankful that you took your time to go through this. Please let me know if you have anything, any feedback. I will be more than happy to hear from you and discuss with you, or if you need any guidance anywhere, I'll be more than happy to avail myself. Thank you very much and have a great day.